Okay, so today we're going to be talking about dialectical materialism just a little bit to try to help to clarify things because I know it's complicated and a new concept. And then we'll also look at how Vygotsky looks at um, higher psychological or psychical and processes. And it's important that we use the concept of psychical as opposed to psychological because psychological has a lot of different meanings. And in the same sense, it's important for us to use the word psyche instead of mind to refer to human consciousness. Before we begin talking about dialectical materialism, one of the things that I was thinking about after last week's seminar is that we tend to look at this course and what it means to be human on a very academic level. And instead, what we should also do is look at it on a personal level. And I was thinking about this in relationship to Epicurus because I was thinking about what is it that gives me joy and how I can bring calm into my own life. And so what we did in seminar was to do an activity that helps get across both the concept of what it means to look at these things individually and at the same time to lay a foundation for our discussion on the whole concept of field, which we will get into. And what we did was we went through a breathing exercise and then focused in on one spot and then gently closed our eyes and then just focused in on the breath. And as different thoughts came in, we just let them pass by. And when after we'd done this for a couple of minutes, and this is something that you might try if you're watching this, after a couple of minutes, then I asked people to think about a very specific time when they felt great feelings of joy and to go back and really recreate the whole situation when they experienced joy and fill it in as much as possible with the visual and the audio, the smell, even taste, and to not only to think about that experience, but actually go through the whole process of experiencing that joy again. And then after a couple of minutes, I asked them to think about and do the same sort of thing with a time of non-joy. And this then helped to get a little bit of a feel for how what Epicurus is talking about with finding what gives you joy, how it can be applied to us individually. And then the goal, obviously, is to do as much as you can that gives you joy and avoid those things or learn to negotiate those things that give you non-joy. Well, then we moved on to dialectical materialism and started with looking at Hegel. And the big contribution that Hegel made was his critique of formal logic. And formal logic, which we talked about in the beginning seminar, A is equal to A, which doesn't really always hold, and A is not equal to B, which does not hold. That whole way of thinking was something that was predominant in science and in philosophy. So this whole structure of formal logic was built up with syllogisms and proofs and whatnot. And Hegel said that that doesn't really capture the nature of the way the world works, and instead introduced this concept of dialectical logic, which means, which we talked about this with the orange, that the bud is sometimes, it's a bud and at the same time is a flower. A, therefore, is equal to B, because that captures process. Formal logic does not capture process, and the epistemological approaches which formal logic, which are built on formal logic, also do not capture process. And so Hegel introduced this concept of process and did it using the concept of history, that things are moving and changing always, that there's nothing constant but change. And so this led to him thinking about, well, where do the ideas that we're talking about come from? And he went back actually and used what Plato had talked about with his forms, where you have a form, an ideal form of a triangle, and that exists. And that ideal form then is manifest in various ways in reality, and we get a picture of it, but we don't have a picture of there's no manifestation of the ideal form. And Hegel used that same logic in looking at ideas. Where do ideas comes from? And he put forward this concept of an absolute ideal, which then led into idealism. And that has been the foundation for subjective psychology and predominates in consciousness studies and in phenomenology, where you're using introspection, ideas about what's going on, as a way to understand the activity, human activity and behavior, but it's all based on the subjective. And that's looking at the mind without looking at the brain. Well, Feuerbach, who Marx and Engels relied on heavily as well as Hegel, critiqued Hegel's idealism and said that we need to ground this dialectical logic in the material world. However, he didn't apply a historical approach, and in so doing, didn't really apply a dialectical approach. It was led a lot more to empiricism and epistemology. And that then led to behaviorist psychology, which was looking at the brain without the mind. And that's the way a lot of neuroscience does. And so we see right here the gap that we've talked about in the seminar between those that look at just the brain without the mind, and then the mind without the brain. Well, Marx and Engels drew on both Hegel and Feuerbach and came up with the concept of dialectical materialism. And the difference was that they were using an ontological approach along with an epistemological. So the ontological is really looking at the concept of being and looking at process, and also drawing on epistemological studies on science and the findings of science. But the being cannot be observed. And so they then their starting point was looking at the brain-mind unity, which Vygotsky drew on and led to his theory of dialectical psychology. And the question then comes up, what is the relationship between Marx and Engels and Vygotsky? Well, Marx and Engels used this approach to study human social formations. And in that developed a theory, what Vygotsky calls an intermediary theory between dialectical materialism, which is a general overarching principle that governs the universe and the laws behind the motion in all matter, in and energy in the universe. And by looking at human social formations, developed the concept of historical materialism. Well, Vygotsky used this same approach, the dialectical ontological materialist approach, but instead of looking at human social formations, he looked at the human psyche, the human consciousness. And in doing so, he had as a foundation for understanding the human psyche, the theory, the findings, the approach that Marx and Engels used in historical materialism. And so while it's based on historical materialism, it's looking at a different subject, the psyche, as opposed to human social formations. Well, this led to what he called psychological materialism or dialectical psychology. And he detailed his whole approach in the historical meaning of the crisis in psychology, a methodological investigation that he wrote when he was being treated for a serious case of tuberculosis in 25, 26, and it came out in 27 with some of his other writings. A student brought up, I think Alelia brought up what is the meaning of this quotation? And so I'll let you read through that. And this captures a very important point. And what it's looking at is you have a general philosophical approach, and that's the dialectical ontological materialism. That's a very general philosophical approach, but you can't investigate anything by just trying to directly apply those principles to to whatever it is that you're investigating. Instead, what needs to be done is to look at that which is being investigated and see what concepts are there, what categories are there, and using the general principles, come up with a theory, a method that looks at that particular area of investigation. And so that's what Vygotsky did. It's important to differentiate method, as we tend to think of it as a technique or an experiment. And Vygotsky's talking about methodology in a general overarching. And then pose the question, what does Vygotsky mean by field? And people wrote about it while you're thinking about it. I can show you my t-shirt, which I thought was appropriate in that we've gone way back through geologic time. And this t-shirt, I think, applies to the mantra that I use for the seminar, and that the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. And somebody who knew that I suffered from the illusion of knowledge gave this to me, because down over here, it says, down in the Devonian period, about 60 million years ago, the little caption says, "The last time I was wrong." And I have been struggling with the illusion of having the illusion of knowledge. And it's something that it's a work in progress, but it's something that I think is fundamental for our seminar, because we all come in with a pretty established way of looking at the world and the belief system, and then everything gets fit into that, as opposed to looking at things with a different perspective, or open eyes, open mind, open psyche. And then the seminar wrote and discussed a bit about how does this concept of field fit in with perception. And our bonobo here, having studied Vygotsky, says, let's go back to the origins if we're going to look at what a field is. And we've talked a bit about the unified energy field, and that this field exists in infinity. It's throughout the space. It goes beyond the universe, but it's a field in the sense that, not that it's something physical, but a field is a theoretical construct that humans have come up with to try to describe how this energy is dispersed and operates throughout either the universe or in infinity. And we're then looking at how the concept of field fits into what it means to be a human being in the development of our psyche. So one example is a temperature field, where you can see the gradation from 100 down to minus 35, and it shows the different elevations there. And so this field then is represented in a map, but out in nature, that field does not exist. It's the way that we're measuring and trying to understand it. And the same holds for the electromagnetic field that exists within the entire universe. It's key to how interactions take place on Earth, and also within the human body. And that figure there is showing the electromagnetic field for the heart, which is, I think, 5,000 times greater than other parts of the body. Well, as we mentioned last week, when the Big Bang, the cosmic inflation, the Big Bang occurred, there was a separation of the main forces, the strong nuclear interaction, the weak nuclear interaction, the magnetism, and then a gravitational field comes into existence with the universe. Those forces govern all motion of matter in the universe. And these are some images taken, the one on the right from a satellite, but a reconstruction of how the gravitational field, has different manifestations in different parts of the world. It's stronger and weaker there. So then how do we look at the concept of field in a living organism? So if we go back to Carrie, we've got the energy that's coming in from the universe. That energy is sensed, it's transduced into the language that Carrie understands, the language being how those proteins work. That information is perceived, judged, with affect being an important part of it, leading to activity and then energy in the world. And so this, when Vygotsky talks about the motor sensory unity, this is what he's talking about, that we take information in, it gets transduced into a different form of energy, and that different form of energy is what goes to construct the internal field. And it's important to differentiate between the external field and the internal field. And there's this concept of awareness, which is important. We tend not to think of one unicell having awareness. And it's true if we take the concept of conscious awareness and apply it back to other organisms. Awareness here means this process of taking information in. That taking in the information is an awareness, and then processing it is also an awareness, in that it leads to activity that then maintains the ability of the organism to survive. So that sensing, perceiving, and acting is what is meant by awareness for living organisms. And I think it's the foundation for consciousness. And eventually, with the dialectical transformation we talk about with the human psyche, it it is the foundation for human consciousness. Well, this internal processing here is what is the internal energy field. And so when Vygotsky talks about the visual field, he's talking about this internal field. Carrie doesn't have eyeballs, even though I call her one-eyed Carrie. But this internal field is where that visual field exists. So just to once again graphically simplify it here, this process is energy processing. Energy processing is the same as what we're talking about with the energy field. The processing is taking place on a chemical, electrical, molecular basis, and all of that processing together constitutes this internal field. And it's important to differentiate between direct action, which is what happens with all organisms and until we get to humans, and with direct action, it means that the sensing and the acting are totally tied together, that there's that unity of those two. And whatever information gets in automatically leads to a particular kind of activity based on the perceiving and the affect. And this direct action is based on an organism's needs and desires. Well, let's look at our bonobo here. And so we've got a similar setup the external information is coming in a far more complex way through the eyes, the nose, and the ears. But all of that energy that's coming in gets transduced into, the language of the brain. And that's what goes to create the internal field, energy field. And the bonobos, like all organisms except humans, are totally tied into direct action. The action that is taken is directly connected to and inseparable from the information that's coming in and the activity. So those two things are united. And he uses the concept of a fixed visual field. And it's important terminologically here to differentiate between the internal visual field that is fixed by that which the perception, the visual perception that's coming in, and a field of vision. These lines here represent a field of vision. And vector, Vygotsky uses the concept of a vector, and a vector just means a vehicle. You can see how you get the word vehicle out of that. But the vector is that the attention is focused in on one object, and that one, the light waves from that particular object then are the dominant, it's the dominant information that's coming in and is part of the internal field. So the bonobo focuses in on the banana, and even though all of the field of vision is this diffused, unseparated mass, that focusing in on one object then provides the vector through which the fixed information, the fixed visual field is created. And this, the way that this is processed, that vector becomes part of the internal visual field. And before we move on to look at how humans, the internal field of humans, I wanted just to say a word about this bonobo here, Kwanzi, with Sue Savage Rumbaugh. She wrote an article that was published in an academic journal and claiming that this bonobo had language. Well, you can imagine the academic world, the linguistic field jumped on this, and this person, Stuart Shanker, was invited to write a rebuttal to her article. And then she was given saying that, no, it's impossible. Bonobos don't have any language. And the Sue Savage Rumbaugh was given the opportunity to respond to Shanker, but instead, what she did was invited him down to the place where she was working with bonobos, invited him to come down for 2 weeks and just spend time with the bonobos and make up his own mind. And he went down there with all sorts of tests and that he could prove that bonobos don't have language. Well, after interacting with the bonobos for 2 weeks, he was out walking with a bonobo in the field, in the forest, and all of a sudden the bonobo grabs his arm and sort of tugs at it, and then gets the symbol board which you can see here. There's over 300 symbols, each representing a concept. And the bonobo pointed to the symbol for bad, and then pointed to a mushroom on the ground. So the bonobo was knowing that he did not understand how the forest worked and everything within the forest. The bonobo then pointed to this mushroom and said, bad. So she had the concept of bad and was able to use a symbol representing the concept of bad and pointing it out to Shankar, and then spent the next hour going through the forest pointing out things that were okay to eat and not okay, which is a process that all organisms go through in helping their young to navigate their particular environment. He, instead of writing another rejoinder, the two of them worked together and put together this book, Apes, Language, and the Human Mind. So let's see how our early human, let's look at the visual, the internal energy field for the human. And with tool work, tool use, this process of interacting with nature and coming up with tools for hitting rocks together and creating knives or weapons, cutting instruments. That use of the tool is an important piece to the jump to the qualitative transformation to the psyche. And I think it's important, and we'll look at this a little bit more in depth next week, is the concept of the dialectical leap, because I think that conjures up images that don't really capture the essence of what's being talked about. And the way that the psyche comes about is that this sound, the rock, then becomes part of this internal energy field, so that by having a sound waves that represent another object, and those sound waves then can be used internally to guide activity. So if no rock is present, the bonobo will go and look for the rock. Whereas the bonobo, if there's this, or chimp, then they did the experiments with chimps, if there's a group of bananas, bunch of bananas, and there's a stick, the chimp will take the stick and knock down bananas. With the exact same scene the next day, if there's not a stick there, the chimp won't go look for one because it's not in their field of vision, and therefore is not in their visual field and is not a part of their perception. However, with the rock, those sound waves represent something else that's not in the field of vision, so that the early human can then go look for a rock. And by doing that, it's giving rock an existence, that rock has being. And we'll talk more about this next time. But by creating that word, that symbol, that sound, that represents something else, so it's symbolic representation, we are also creating a past and a future, because with having the words, the concepts, those can be used to plan and guide activity. So this whole internal process of transducing, sensing, perceiving, all of that gets fundamentally, qualitatively transformed with the introduction of meaning, human and human language. And that is what separates humans from the rest of the animal world. And it's that which is the psyche. And so it's best when you're reading and you see mental processes to think of psychical processes, processes that are human processes. Vygotsky has that word in the Russian, but it gets translated into English as mental. And so where you see mind, think of psyche, and that'll help to hold on to this concept that we're dealing with human consciousness and this qualitative transformation that takes place. Well, the energy, this internal energy field, we've focused in on the visual, but this internal energy field includes all of the energy that's taking place within the human body. And you get a feel for it here. And this goes and looks at the heart, and that how it's the electromagnetic field, you can see down at the bottom for the heart, is 5,000 times more powerful than the brain. And so the EKG shows that between 10 and 100 times larger than the EEG of the brain. And so this the internal energy field is all of the energy processing that's taking place within the body. And so it's regulating the body, maintaining homeostasis, but at the same time, it's getting information in, processing it, and acting on it. So for the bonobos and animals, the bonobos are actually beginning to move with the help of humans into a symbolic representation that they don't have in the wild. But their interactions with nature, as I mentioned, are tied directly in to what they perceive and then how they act. With the humans, it becomes mediated in the sense that there is still this direct interaction with nature, but an important element is added, and that is the tool. So the tool mediates the human's activity with nature. It goes between a physical created tool, and this is important, it's a created tool. The animal kingdom modifies but does not create tools in the same way that early humans did. This created tool then mediates human activity with nature. And this is a point that Marx and Engels underscored, that by changing nature using these tools, humanity changed itself. And he was referring to this whole process that we've been discussing with mediation. And so their activity in the world is mediated. And then the similar sort of mediation, an analogous mediation, takes place with the use of a sign, a rock. And when I say analogous, Vygotsky makes very clear that this analogy between the sign and language and the tool is talking only about one thing, and that is the fact of mediation. So people, Leontiev and others, have Kazulin latched onto this idea of psychological tools. Vygotsky said this analogy to tool use was only for the formal logic side of it and did not include the genetic or the functional structural side of it. And then, in other words, it was not a useful analogy. It could not be extended the way that others have. And when the phrases that Vygotsky says this is not a useful analogous were taken out right in the middle of a paragraph, taken out of Mind in Society, which is where is the book that a lot of people read for trying to understand Vygotsky. It, it also has a problem in that different sections from completely different works of Vygotsky are patched together. So he's talking about a completely different concept in these two different places, and they're thrown together in one article. And so it really does not get to the essence of what he is talking about. So this sign mediates activity. And we talked earlier about semiotic mediation and semiosis. It's important here to also recognize that the sign, the mediation activity, is something that there's an external sign and there's the internal sign. And those two things are not equivalent. Most all of the emphasis by Peirce and others who study semiotics is on, and Wittgenstein studying language, is the structure and the logic of external sign use. And it's very useful. However, it does not address what's going on, what is the system, how is the sign being used as part of cognitive activity. Well, we looked at this dialectical leap for bonobos, and we'll look at an infant here. And one thing that's important to look at, and we'll talk about this more later, but I think it'll help for everybody to gain a deeper appreciation of Vygotsky's work, is all of the things that we were talking about with the rest of the animal kingdom are things that are replayed, replicated with the individual child. So while early humans went through this qualitative transformation from elementary mental processes to higher psychical processes, the individual child does that as well. So, but he points out that ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny. That there's a big difference between the human species development and the individual. One, because the individual already has an existing language system there, that for early humans, they actually had to develop it. And that the early humans had developed biologically pretty much to the point of modern humans. There's been some small phenotypic changes in the body structure, et cetera. But basically it's the same, whereas for the child, they're going through this whole developmental process and growth at the same time they're taking on cultural aspects like language acquisition. So just as the bonobo was tied to the field of vision, so children at their early ages are. But then with the introduction of a sound, doggy, there's a transformation that takes place. Initially, doggy is just part of this information that's coming in. The sound waves of doggy are just a part of this whole affective experience that the child is going through, getting energy in through the vision, the smell, the taste, the touch of interacting with a doggy. Now, over time and through generalization, the child comes to understand that this doggy, the sound waves, represent not just this particular little boxer puppy, but all dogs, but it doesn't refer to kitties nor inanimate objects that represent a doggy. If you look at the little guy on the left there, you can almost hear him saying, "Where's the essence?" What happens with through this generalization, there's a removal of the sound from the object. And then the sound exists as a word, and that word then gets separated from the sound, and the word becomes the meaning. And that's that internalization process that takes place. And this is huge. This is the key to Vygotsky's theory, that it's that taking in of meaning through words that the whole structure of the human psyche develops. And we'll see this more with meaning at the core of the thinking, languaging system that Vygotsky creates to describe the internal use of languaging, of the sign operation. And that meaning he's talking about as internal in almost all of the representations. People are talking about Vygotsky and meaning as external, and they miss the essence of his work. And somebody asked about this quotation, but the higher functions of perception, memory, and attention, movements internally connected with the sign activity of the child, can be understood only on the basis of analysis of their genetic roots and the reorganization to which they are subjected in the process of their cultural history. And I'll let you read through that one more time. And so again, he emphasizes genetic roots. And it's always important whenever you see the word genetic analysis, he's not talking about genes. Genes and genesis have the same etymology from the Proto-Indo-European word that represents a clan, a birth coming into existence. And so Vygotsky's using it as going back and understanding the orange. And so when you see genetic, think about the orange. And it's important here, this interrelationship between the biological development, the natural development, and the cultural development. So we talked about this before, this concept of the supreme transcendent being. And I asked you a couple of weeks ago to think about belief and how did belief fit into human development, with the transcendent rising above and immanent being at hand, contained within it. And I think it was last week, mentioned that while we're talking about all of this, especially when we're talking about belief systems and origins, where did the universe come from, etc., I use the formulation of put aside your belief system. But instead, I think it might be better if you conceptualize it as any supreme transient being that you may have a belief in, that supreme being will have a plan. And that plan is how the universe works. And so what we're really doing is looking at what that plan is. It's not all just written out, it's discovered. And that's what humanity has done, has understanding the order, the motion, the forces, the processes within the universe. And that has been discovered from the early humans up to the present day. And so in your own belief systems, whatever they are, you can think about that supreme transient being, but our focus is on being that exists within the universe. And that is what we will talk about next time when we look at the role of belief in human development, and also the concept of dialectical leap, or I think better, a dialectical qualitative transformation. So thank you for your attention, and I will end here.